How can you get a boat to move from one side to the other side and to cross the mountain? Stevens and the rest of American engineers, we need to find a new way to do it.
The answer was a lock canal, a highly engineered, mechanized waterway that would solve the multiple problems of Panama all at once. First, to control the Chagres, a massive dam would be built at Gatun, creating an artificial lake some 85 feet above sea level, roughly in the middle of the canal's planned route.
In order to get to this lake, the ship would be raised by a series of locks.
These locks are each going to be these huge concrete structures, more than 3 football fields long. They're going to hold tens of millions of gallons of water, them to raise ships up over the American continent, in effect.
What it was to set up a series of steps, hydraulically elevate the ship, where the boats will go up a step, come across.
It would sail across the artificial lake, go through Culebra Cut, which of course now didn't need to be cut out nearly so drastically, and then would descend again in steps down into the Pacific and away.
By 1911, the Americans were finally making real progress on the canal, and headlines all over the world. Suddenly now tourists from everywhere were flocking to Panama to see the engineering marvel of the age. What the Americans were doing with the canal, said one awed visitor, was the greatest liberty ever taken with nature. No aspect of the construction compelled such fascination as the gargantuan locks, the so-called mighty portals to the Panama Gateway.
These locks are these huge concrete structures with these incredibly elaborate culverts. They are this enormous engineering challenge, the biggest engineering project there's been in the history of the Earth until then.
In all, some 5 million bags and barrels of concrete went into the building of the locks, dams, and spillways. Mixed on site and deposited into enormous 6-ton buckets, the concrete was then hoisted by crane, delivered by cableway, and poured from above. The amount poured at Gatun alone, some 2 million cubic yards, could have built a wall 12 feet high and long enough to encircle the island of Manhattan more than 4 times.
This was far bigger locks than had ever been constructed before. And really it was about just doing everything much bigger. There were a couple of very clever ideas, one of which was to have the lock gates hollow and watertight, so therefore buoyant, which meant that far less of the weight had to be carried by the lock's hinges.
Although they were 80-some feet high, they were so precisely balanced, they could be operated by a single 40-horsepower motor.
The whole operation was powered by electricity. And this was in a very early days this was before many factories were electrified. And this electricity was generated nearby by the water from the spillway, by hydroelectric. And this powered all of the systems that made the locks work. The locks were the mechanical marvel of the canal.
These locks are more than just tons of concrete, said one observer. They are the answer of courage and faith to doubt and unbelief. In them are the blood and sinew of a great and hopeful nation, the fulfillment of ancient ideals, and the promise of larger growth to come. In the spring of 1913, 9 years almost to the day after the Americans started work on the Panama Canal, they began at last to finish it. In May, steam shovels number 222 and 230 dumped their last loads and met in the center of Culebra Cut. In June, the last spillway at Gatun Dam was sealed, allowing the waters of Gatun Lake to rise to their full height. In August, the dikes at either end of the line were blown, and the oceans rushed inland to the gates of the locks. In September, the first trial lockage was made, from the Atlantic harbor at Cologne all the way up to the lake. By summer's end, there was only one remaining dry span in the channel, the 9-mile stretch of Culebra Cut. And that was to be flooded on Monday, October 10th. Early that afternoon, a crowd began to gather at Gamboa, on the edge of Gatun Lake. Workers and their families, visiting dignitaries from the United States, tourists from as far away as Europe and East Asia. At 2 p.m., in a stunt devised by a newspaperman, President Woodrow Wilson was scheduled to push a button at his desk in the White House, releasing by telegraph a current that would blow up the Gamboa dike and send the waters of Gatun Lake rushing into the cut.
We could easily see the dike with men still working around it. Not many yards to one side was the gash of the cut. Not very deep here. The small waves lapped eagerly at the edge, as though the lake was also waiting to let go of its overload of water. Tension mounted.
As Jan van Hardenveld put it to Rose, the event would either be a historic success or a historic failure. No one knows. At Gamboa, the clock struck 2.
There was a reverent silence. No one spoke at all. There was a low rumble, a dull, muffled boom. A triple column shot high in the center, turned, and gracefully fell to both sides like a fountain. From the multitude came a spontaneous, long, loud roar of such joy and relief that I felt sure I would remember the sound all my life. As the water poured out of the lake into the cut, hats came off. We saw Jan and the engineer in charge of the cut shake hands. They were both crying. We were crying too.
The canal's official opening was scheduled for August 15th, 1914. 12 days before, a ship called the Cristobal made a final practice run and became the first seagoing vessel ever to successfully cross from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific through the Panama Canal.
It's pretty amazing going through the locks. You nose forward into this space, then 26 million gallons of water pour by gravity through underground culverts into that lock and raise you up 30 feet or so. It's an amazing, beautiful, dramatic experience.
And when you're on the ship and you feel it rising up and you move, you feel it rising up and you're witnessing what's happening. A ship climbing a mountain. I mean, that is mind-boggling.
It had taken 10 years of ceaseless grinding toil, an outlay of more than $350 million, the largest single federal expenditure in history to that time, and the loss of more than 5,000 lives. But the successful completion of the Panama Canal had defined the United States to the world and announced the arrival of a new power for the new century.
It was a symbol to Americans. This is what American power, technological know-how, determination, managerial organization, all of those things that Americans prided themselves on and still do to a certain extent. This is what it can do for the whole world.
After 500 years of people dreaming, now it was done. Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were forever united. The United States were now firmly established as the most powerful nation on earth.
It all occurred at such a pivotal moment in our history. The failure of the French effort was very much the sort of the dying gasp of the Victorian age that had been dominated by Europe. With the opening of the American Canal, the power in the world had shifted irrevocably, and the American century effectively could begin.